Hello, and welcome to Western Civ, episode 295, The Unknown Queen. When Elizabeth I ascended to the throne, she was an unknown quantity. People knew that Mary had been an ardent Catholic. People had every reason to expect that Edward would be guided by the evangelicals in his household. But Elizabeth? Well, no one really knew what to think. Elizabeth had been extremely young during Henry VIII's reign. She was only 14 years old when he died. She had been a teenager during the bulk of the reigns of her siblings. She had played the role of a good evangelical, and then told Mary she was Catholic. So which was it? It is interesting to think that Elizabeth, the last of Henry's children to rule, would have the longest and, by far, most important impact on England and European history. Her sister Mary had ruled England for 5 unhappy years. During those years, England lost Calais, its last prize from the long-gone 100 Years' War. England came out of Mary's reign riven with religious strife and very much a minor power on the periphery of Europe. France and Spain were by far more powerful and more aggressive, and they were right next door. There would have been many at the time of Elizabeth's ascension that would have guessed England would have become some kind of client state to either great power, or, at the very least, that England would continue its current downward trajectory. But it didn't. Elizabeth's story is simply amazing. It's unlikely to the extreme. From the moment of her mother's death, she was written off. Yet she would be the monarch to finally right England's ship of state after a tumultuous decade plus. It's a remarkable story, and integral to Western history. Today, we begin to tell it. Elizabeth's first act as sovereign was to give official thanks for her peaceful transition to power. In this age, that counted for quite a lot. The next decision she made was just as crucial. Elizabeth decided from the outset that there would not be any foreign interference in her administration. She had witnessed for herself the devastating impact of Mary's marriage to Philip, and Philip to Mary's illegitimacy as an English monarch. She would have none of that for herself. Not from any European nation, and certainly not from Rome. She wanted to be a focus for English nationalism. In her words, quote, "the most English woman in England," end quote. In terms of her lineage, she couldn't have been more right. Her father, Henry VIII, had Plantagenet stock in his blood. Anne Boleyn, Elizabeth's mother, had no royal lineage, but she was English through and through. Elizabeth was not quite 3 years old when her mother was executed for treason. No one knows when or how she found out about her mother's death. We can only guess at the impact her mother's death would have had on her emotionally. We do know Elizabeth was confused why one day she was addressed as Lady Princess and the very next as Lady Elizabeth. Certainly, she recognized the change. Nor do we know whether or not she believed in her mother's guilt. She made only 2 references in adult life to Anne Boleyn, neither of them particularly revealing, although she was close to and prompted the interest of several relatives on her mother's side. What is clear is that throughout her life, she revered the memory of her sometimes terrifying father, who had declared her a bastard, and could not bear to have much contact in the years with her, following Anne Boleyn's disgrace. Those years, as we know, brought a succession of stepmothers for Elizabeth, all of whom took pity on the motherless child and did their best to restore her to favor. Perhaps the worst episode in her childhood occurred when Elizabeth was 8 years old. The king's fifth wife, Catherine Howard, a cousin of Anne Boleyn actually, was a young girl who unwisely admitted former lovers into her household, and of course it was later alleged into her bed. Late in 1541, her crimes were uncovered. The king wept when told, but would not see her. In February 1542, she met the same fate as Anne Boleyn. It was around this time that Elizabeth reportedly told her friend, the young Robert Dudley, son of the Earl of Warwick, quote, "I will never marry," end quote. Some writers have suggested that the events of her childhood led her to equate marriage with death, and although there is no evidence to support this theory, I don't think that there's any doubt that this was a traumatic time for Elizabeth, with Catherine Howard's execution reviving a painful memory of what had happened to her mother. When Henry married Catherine Parr in 1543, Elizabeth finally found something like a normal family life. Catherine was a calming influence over Henry and was able to get Elizabeth readmitted to court. Yet, even then, Henry had her exiled for a year for some unknown reason. While the two reconciled just before his death in 1547, I do not see how anyone could interpret Henry's influence on his daughter's life as anything but negative. Now, Henry might have been a neglectful father for sure, but he was concerned with his daughter's education. At the age of 6, Henry made sure Elizabeth started getting an education that would befit a Renaissance prince. Henry's final wife, Catherine Parr, made sure that that continued after the king's death. She also made sure that Elizabeth was given the best Protestant education possible, filling her studies with some of the best evangelical tutors of the age, a feat, obviously, easier done during Edward's reign. As we will see, those formative religious teachings had an impact. Elizabeth was highly intelligent, everyone says that. In fact, some of her tutors declared her to be the most educated woman in England. That was at roughly the age of 10. Hyperbole, for sure, but not far from the truth. Like most educated gentlewomen of her day, Elizabeth was encouraged to become the equal of men in learning and to outdo, quote, the vaunted paragons of Greece and Rome, end quote. The curriculum devised for her was, of course, punishing by today's standards, but she thrived on intellectual exercises, and she had a gift for languages, which she enjoyed showing off. As queen, she read and conversed fluently in Latin, French, and Greek, Spanish, Italian, and Welsh, which is no easy feat. She had read the New Testament in Greek, the orations of Isocrates, and tragedies of Sophocles, amongst many other classical works. Her interest in philosophy and history endured throughout her life. She would set aside 3 hours each day, even when she was queen, just to read historical books. Elizabeth had hobbies beyond the classroom. She loved horseback riding, enjoyed outdoor walks, loved practicing what we would call today calligraphy. She really enjoyed penmanship. And above all, she loved to dance, though, to be fair, she had little occasion to practice dancing prior to her ascension. The first time Elizabeth would get to use her rhetorical skills was during the Lord Seymour affair. As you will recall, Seymour had this nasty habit of flirting with the young princess, a charge that became serious after his wife, Catherine Parr, remember he married her after Henry's death, and especially after Seymour's downfall, when even Elizabeth's own servants were questioned about her conduct. But Elizabeth was up for the challenge and defended herself quite ably. In the end, we know she salvaged her name and her reputation. During Mary's reign, Elizabeth did her best to stay out of the limelight. Mary always suspected Elizabeth of being a secret Protestant. In one of the early revolts against her rule, Mary had Elizabeth imprisoned in the Tower for 3 months because she suspected the princess of being complicit. Nothing, however, could be proven. Based on later speeches Elizabeth would make, this 3-month period was one of the most difficult of her young life. According to what she would later say, Elizabeth believed every single day during that 3 months to get notice that she had been condemned and would be executed like her mother and her aunt. Throughout the rest of her life, Elizabeth would repeatedly thank God for intervening in this incident and saving her life. Now, in actuality, it was actually King Philip who had intervened on Elizabeth's behalf, but perhaps there was an additional mystical hand. I'll leave that to the theologians. Regardless, Elizabeth remained in the country for the rest of Mary's reign, doing her best to stay the heck out of trouble and look the dutiful subject. Elizabeth was 25 years old at the time of her ascension and considered attractive by many. She was slender. She had her mother's high cheekbones and her father's ruddy reddish hair. Her complexion was olive-toned, a fact that Elizabeth hated throughout her life, and she would use various potions in an effort to whiten it. As I mentioned at the beginning, Elizabeth's character at the time that she took the throne was a bit of a mystery. She'd kept to herself for years. She had hinted at her Protestant leaning, but hadn't given any clear indications. Now, here's what one historian, Alison Weir, had to say about Elizabeth. Quote, always dignified and stately in her bearing, she could also be vain, willful, dictatorial, temperamental, and imperious. Her sense of humor sometimes had a malicious edge to it, and she was capable of making sharp, cutting remarks. Yet she could be warm and compassionate when occasion demanded, particularly towards the old and sick, the bereaved, and those who had suffered misfortune. She had courage, both in her convictions and in the face of danger, and was not above metaphorically thumbing her nose at her enemies. Possessing an innate humanity, she was not normally cruel, unlike most of the rulers of her day, and many regarded her as being unusually tolerant in that age of religious dogmatism. She saw herself as a paragon of honor and honesty, who dealt with others in a straightforward manner, and would stand by, quote, the word of a prince. But the reality was somewhat different. She could prevaricate, dissemble, and deceive as well as any other ruler of her time. The need constantly to economize had made her so careful with money as to appear parsimonious, and to the end of her life, she would avoid spending if she could. Caution was her watchword in all her dealings. She took no more risks than she had to. She had learned in a hard school. She had also learned to use femininity to her advantage, artfully stressing her womanly weakness and shortcomings, even indulging in effective storms of weeping, whilst at the same time displaying many of the qualities most admired in men. She had wisdom, common sense, staying power, integrity, and tenacity, which, along with the ability to compromise, a hard-headed sense of realism, and a devious, subtle brain, would make her a monarch worthy of respect. Men might despise her sex, and they might mistake her finely calculated sense of timing for dithering, but they learned to appreciate her abilities, even if they did not always understand how her mind worked. Her unpredictability, her tendency to unconventional behavior, and above all, her ability to change her mind far more than they deemed necessary, or to put off making decisions for what seemed like an inordinate length of time. End quote. Unlike her siblings, Elizabeth was as healthy as the proverbial horse. She did suffer from what we would call panic attacks, however. Moreover, like her father, she had a rather short fuse. Neither could she tolerate loud noises. She loved flirting. In fact, throughout her life, she seemed to take endless joy in the idea that every man was in love with her. For this reason, she tended to see other women as a threat. On November 17, 1558, Elizabeth ascended to the throne. That day, she summoned her closest advisors for what was to be her first Privy Council meeting. Most of the men assembled were surprised at her businesslike acumen, but one was not, and that was William Cecil. He had been with Elizabeth for years already. For the next 40 years, he would be Elizabeth's chief advisor and her closest friend. Cecil was now 38. He had attended Cambridge and had a degree in law. Under Edward VI, he had prospered and secured several important legal positions. In 1551, Cecil had been knighted. William Cecil was by nature a cautious man. He believed firmly in preserving the medieval social order and the prerogatives of the monarch. He was a patriot and quite conservative. But his calm demeanor was what mattered most. It was the quality Elizabeth would rely upon most in the years to come. Cecil was a fervent Protestant, and as a result, his career had largely stagnated under Mary. Throughout Edward and then Mary's reigns, Cecil advised Elizabeth on political and financial matters, and she quickly came to appreciate his worth. Elizabeth had this habit throughout her name of giving those closest to her nicknames. It, in fact, came to be a sign of royal favor to have one bestowed upon you. Elizabeth called Cecil her spirit, and we can see the value she believed he brought to her life in the following letter. Quote, "Sir Spirit, I doubt I do nickname you, for those of your kind, they say, have no sense. But I have seen an ekesegum, that if an ass kick you, you feel it too soon. I will recant you from being my spirit, if ever I perceive that you disdain not such a feeling. Serve God, fear the king, and be a good fellow to the rest. Do not be so silly a soul as to not regard her trust who puts it in you. God bless you, and long may you last." End quote. At that first meeting of her Privy Council, missives declaring Elizabeth's ascension were drafted and sent abroad. 3 days of mourning were declared for Mary. Then the meeting ended. The next day, everyone met again to begin filling the various vacancies that had cropped up every time a new monarch took the throne. The first question was the critical post of Master of Horse. Elizabeth picked Robert Dudley for that. It was a surprise choice in a lot of ways. Dudley's father was the one who had attempted to supplant both Mary and Elizabeth with Lady Jane Grey, and he lost his head for it. Dudley himself had spent time in the Tower, and for many his name was tainted with treason. But Elizabeth picked him. She thought the choice was logical. Dudley's brother had held the same position under Edward. Moreover, Elizabeth and Dudley had been close since childhood. It was an early sign of favor that would be crucial in later years. Dudley's job was not purely ceremonial, by the way. He was in charge of breeding and providing horses for the Queen and her retinue, a crucial task in the 16th century. He also had to organize state processions and entertainment, an equally important job. He was suited to both. Dudley absolutely loved horses and knew every rule of chivalry. He also encouraged Elizabeth to ride daily. Given that the Queen loved riding already, it should come as no surprise that she quickly took his advice. Before long, the Queen was often seen riding in the company with her Master of Horse, who also, I should say, happened to be tall and handsome. He was a true Renaissance man. Dudley was interested in subjects that ranged from mathematics and theology all the way down to biology and, as we mentioned, horsemanship. He spoke French and Italian fluently. Dudley's appointment and his obvious favor with the young queen did dismay those at court who feared a revival of his family's ambitions and power. Some remembered that not only his father but also his grandfather, Edmund Dudley, had gone to the block for treason, the latter at the beginning of Henry VIII's reign, although it now seems likely that Edmund was merely a scapegoat for Henry VII's unpopular financial policies. We covered that many episodes ago. Yet it wasn't long before Elizabeth's favor extended to other members of Dudley's family, notably Robert's brother Ambrose and his sister Mary, who became one of the ladies of the bedchamber to whom the Queen was most devoted. On November the 20th, William Cecil was appointed Secretary of State. It was not the highest position in the English government at the time, but it did allow Elizabeth to forge a close working relationship with the man she trusted the most. I should note that though Cecil was highly misogynistic and did not believe that women had the temperament to rule, at least that's what he thought at first, but Elizabeth would quickly prove him wrong. Many of the lords of Mary's Privy Council actually stayed on, but those whose Catholic leanings were a bit too strong and a bit too obvious were dismissed and replaced with Protestant lords of Elizabeth's choosing. Some were not replaced at all, as Elizabeth's Privy Council was to be much smaller than Mary's or Edward's. According to our record, then Elizabeth closed the second meeting of her Privy Council with the following statement: "The law of nature moves me to sorrow for my sister. The burden that falleth upon me marketh me amazed, and yet considering I am God's creature, ordained to obey his appointment, I will yield thereto, desiring from the bottom of my heart that I may have assistance of his grace to be the minister of his heavenly will in this office now committed to me. And as I am but one body, so I shall require you all, my lords, to be assistant to me, that I, with my ruling, and you with my service, may make a good account to Almighty God, and leave some comfort to our posterity on earth. I mean to direct all mine actions by good advice and counsel. My meaning is to require of you all nothing more but faithful hearts, and of my good will you shall not doubt, using yourselves as good and loving subjects." For the next 3 days, Elizabeth and Cecil worked to fill the various vacancies left by the transition, both in the government and in her household. Remember, this is an age when the monarch was the government, so household positions mattered a lot, because proximity to power matters a lot. One of the first foreign visitors to see Elizabeth was from Philip, King of Spain. Philip was keen to make sure the prior alliance between the Tudors and the Habsburgs continued. He needed England to help protect the Low Countries from France, though said Low Countries would soon be a major headache for him rather than a benefit, as we know. Henry II in France, for his part, declared Elizabeth a bastard and ineligible for the English throne. He asserted Mary, Queen of Scots, as England's true queen. More on that later. As a result of all of this, Elizabeth, naturally, favored an alliance with Philip, at least early on. Of course, everyone expected Elizabeth to marry. It was assumed that a woman of her age would want nothing more. It was also assumed that women who remained single had unstable minds. In Philip's mind, there was only one proper match for Elizabeth: himself. Habsburg ambassadors floated the idea to Cecil and others, who demurred. Elizabeth was an independent woman. She would not rush any major decision like this, they were told. And honestly, even Philip had his misgivings. He knew Elizabeth wasn't Catholic, and worse yet, he knew she might not be as pliable as Mary had been. Philip, in all reality probably, never intended to marry in England again, though the possibility remained widely debated during Elizabeth's first year. On November the 28th, Elizabeth entered London for the first time as queen. Thousands turned out to see her, and they fell in love with her almost at once. One commenter wrote as follows: "If any person had either the gift or the style to win the hearts of the people, it was this queen. All her faculties were in motion, and every motion seemed a well-guided action. Her eye was set upon her. Her ear listened to another. Her judgment ran upon a third. To a fourth she addressed her speech. Her spirit seemed everywhere. Some she pitied, some she commended, some she thanked. At others she pleasantly and wittily jested, condemning no person, neglecting no office. distributing her smiles, looks, and graces so artfully that thereupon the people again redoubled the testimony of their joys, and afterwards, raising everything to the highest strain, filled the ears of all men with immoderate extolling of their prince. Elizabeth remained in London for some time before moving on to Whitehall Palace on the 23rd of December. Whitehall was to be her principal and favorite residency throughout her reign. While Philip's ambassador went along with the royal retinue, he was given no audience with the Queen, who wanted it clear from the outset she would govern without foreign interference. Unlike Henry VIII, who had given over all his time to pleasure during the early years of his reign and left the business of governing to others, Elizabeth worked hard every day, finalizing plans for her household and attending to state business. She insisted that every letter arriving at court be brought to her inspection, much to Cecil's dismay, because he believed that a woman had no business poking her nose into matters that were properly the concern of the Privy Council. When he found out, for example, that a dispatch from overseas had been taken straight to Elizabeth without first being shown to him as Secretary of State, his irritation increased. And it was further aggravated when the Queen revealed that she had already discussed the contents of the letter with the messenger who had delivered it. Later, Cecil would lecture the poor fellow, saying he had no right to take it to Elizabeth. The young Queen had from the first established a set daily routine. She would get up early, went in all the worst weather for a short but brisk walk in the palace gardens. She then had her breakfast served to her in the privy chamber, where she would remain while she attended to the day's business, summoning her various secretaries, who would kneel before her to present letters and documents that needed the royal signature. She might, then, preside over a meeting of the Privy Council. At noon, dinner was served to her, again in the Privy Chamber. Elizabeth actually rarely ate in public. In the afternoon, she might hold more formal receptions in her presence chamber for foreign ambassadors and other visitors, remaining standing for hours on end and conversing fluent in Latin. Usually, she would set aside time in which to indulge her passion for dancing. It was not unusual, by the way, for her to dance 6 spirited dances in the presence chamber. In the evenings, there would be state banquets or courtly entertainments to attend. Elizabeth loved music of all kinds and welcomed many performers at her court. Sometimes, she herself would play on the lute. Later in the evenings, after supper, she would play cards with her courtiers. But she usually worked for an hour or so on state papers before retiring to bed, and was not above summoning Cecil or other counselors at all hours of the night if she wanted or needed some advice. Often, she would make a decision at midnight, but change her mind in the morning. Needless to say, this kind of behavior drove her advisors mad. Mary was buried in early December with all the Catholic rites. Yet, though Elizabeth had not made any official announcements regarding religion, her behavior left few wondering which way she was leaning. A dispirited Spanish ambassador wrote back to Philip as follows, quote, "The kingdom is entirely in the hands of young folks, heretics, and traitors. The old people and the Catholics are disaffected, but dare not open their lips. Her Majesty seems to me incomparably more feared than her sister, and gives her orders and has her way as absolutely as her father did. We have lost a kingdom, body and soul," end quote. The ambassador, likewise, had grown increasingly dismayed about the prospect of a match between Elizabeth and Philip, who still had not proposed, and, of course, the alliance with England that would come with it. The same ambassador wrote to Philip that if he didn't propose soon, Elizabeth might choose an Englishman for a husband and all would be lost. England got a real sense of Elizabeth's religious leanings that Christmas. During her Christmas service, as the priest held the host aloft in the Catholic manner, Elizabeth angrily ordered him to desist. When he did not, she stormed from the room. Days later, Elizabeth issued a proclamation that parts of the Mass might be said in English rather than Latin, and that when Parliament met, scheduled for January, the religious issue would be decided. As a result, Philip decided, finally, to move before any final religious decisions were made. On January the 10th, he informed his ambassador to propose to Elizabeth, who did so several days later on his king's behalf. The ambassador wanted to see Elizabeth alone, but she was still in the process of planning her coronation, which she wanted to be as magnificent as possible. This was still an age when legitimacy might be conferred through awe and spectacle. Elizabeth wanted to use both. The date was set for January the 13th, 1559. The cost, just over £16,000. £10.5 million in today's money. Cheap, by the way, compared to what the recent Charles III paid earlier this year. His cost was nearly £100 million. Next time, Elizabeth's coronation, early religious questions, and a firm answer for Philip. In the meantime, if you're interested in supporting Western Civ, or if you'd like more Western Civ, check out the link to Western Civ 2.0 in the show notes. You get a 7-day free trial, and if you enjoy it for $1 a month, that's $12 a year if you do the math, I believe. And you get no ads whatsoever. And for $2 a month, which I think is double, somewhere in the range of 24, you can get access to additional types of programming.